welcome to this conference on injuries. I think it's the 5th conference we've done so far. Really looking forward to this one. And I'm just going to run through a short bios of each person, just in case we're not aware of everyone on the panel. So Celest Periera, South African born. Celeste holds a degree in physiotherapy and teaches anatomy to yoga teachers. She specializes in functional neurology and how it can be applied to improve pain, health, and performance. And she is one of the most popular UK yoga teachers. She joins us from London today. Welcome, Celeste. Thanks for coming on. Good to see you. David Keil, Miami-based. David is a neuromuscular therapist and instructor of kinesiology. He's a long-term Ashtanga practitioner, educator and creator of yoga anatomy website, DVDs and training courses for individuals and teacher trainings. He has taught popular workshops worldwide for many years on yoga anatomy. David has also undergone surgery for a torn meniscus. Dave Christensen. Having practiced Ashtanga yoga at an advanced level for many years, Dave was forced to reassess her teaching due to her struggles with back pain from sticking to the traditional Ashtanga sequences. So through this, she has created the Day One method, a method of teaching students individually, and she lives in Florida and teaches online and worldwide. Ellen Joannesen has practiced Ashtanga since 1994. Opened the first Ashtanga school in her hometown, Oslo, Norway. Her teaching is now heavily influenced by Tibetan Buddhism, and she spent years living and teaching in Kathmandu, Nepal, where she completed a degree in Buddhist studies. Ellen has also recently undergone a total hip replacement. Francesca Derico. She's practiced Ashtanga for over 25 years alongside her work as a dancer and dance teacher in London and Milan. Our discussion in the comments of one of my posts on injuries was the inspiration for this conference. So thank you, Francesca. She has undergone knee surgery recently, I believe, and is still in the process of recovery. She lives in Tuscany, Italy. And we have Leslie, a long-term yoga educator who teaches in the lineage of teacher TKV Desikachar. He is the founder of the well-known non-profit organization, The Breathing Project in New York, and he co-wrote the best-selling book Yoga Anatomy, which has sold over 1 million copies and has been translated to over 23 languages. He lives in New York. It's an excellent book, by the way. Dr. Rob Lamport. Rob has been a doctor of chiropractic doctor since 2000 and the founder of the educational website More Than Anatomy. Rob spent many years living in Mysore and treating the many broken yogis there. He's been a yoga practitioner since the age of 23 and teaches worldwide with his wife and renowned Ashtanga yoga teacher, Tara Mitra. Rob is joining us from the UK today. Okay, so I started practicing Ashtanga around 2000, I think, and while studying for a degree in philosophy, mainly for mental health reasons, actually. I had excellent results in that area. Over the next years, however, I tore both my meniscus, as well as suffering chronic back pain. So alongside my wife, Teresa, I run the platform Keil Yoga, which is bringing you this conference today. And I'm currently in Thailand. If you want to find more about everyone, go to keilyoga.com for more information. Right, so that out of the way. Thanks everyone for joining us. And I think we'll kick off the first question, which is, what are the most common injuries you see in yoga generally? I'll direct that first to Celeste.
Thank you for having me, Adam. Less of an injury and more of a dysfunction. What I see happen is there's a lot of sort of over-cueing of individual muscles, particularly out of context. So when I'm in my clinic, I'll always ask a really detailed history from people, and I'll ask random questions that you think don't have any relevance, like constipation, painful sex, incontinence, anxiety. And if there's maybe one or a collection of those, I usually then next look at their breathing, their mechanics, and how that's working. And it's really crazy how many people are over-recruiting their core and pelvic floor. And so just one of the things that I'll do is encourage people to know that it's okay to relax those muscles. Even if you are in your practice, they're so much stronger when they can move through a full range of motion. And in addition to that, to remember that for a muscle to truly be strong and to be working at its best, it should be reflexive. It should be that the brain is doing it automatically. And the example I always use is if you were playing a team sport and there was someone attacking you and you were trying to get the ball into the goal, you wouldn't have enough cognitive load to also then think about engaging individual muscles. You would just play the sport. And so that reflexive nature is really what I'm trying to get people to move closer towards, to kind of get out of those dysfunctional patterns. And then, I mean, the last example I'll just give is if you were to drink a glass of water, we wouldn't really think about the bicep, and it would obviously contract a lot less than if you were lifting a heavy dumbbell. So that context is, I think, something also that is potentially leading to those dysfunctions.
Excellent, thank you. So, by the way, I've muted everyone, all the panelists, and unmute yourself when I ask you the question. Sorry. Also, one more thing. Everyone on the participants level, write your questions in the chat box, and if we get time, we'll go around and ask some questions, and maybe direct them to a particular person, even if you want to hear from a particular person. Anyway, Leslie, what are the most common injuries you see?
Well, just from introducing the panelists, I guess you could take a stab at knees, perhaps. I've had 2 meniscectomies myself, and I'm pretty much bone on bone in my left knee at this point. It hasn't really stopped me all that much from doing the things I want to do, considering I don't want to do things like full lotus. So, you would have to qualify a question like that with like what style of yoga, of asana are people doing? And since this is a very Ashtanga heavy conversation, you do have to mention knees and shoulders and wrists, just as at places that are at biomechanical risk from the repetitive motions that are done in that particular sequencing. And the lotus is a particular risk to the cartilage in the knees that, as I know, David has pointed out, and some of the first things I heard about David when he went online was his very nice explanation of, how basically not to tear your knee to shreds if you're pulling it into lotus or half lotus or something. And that's just a mechanical thing. When you combine flexion and rotation with the 2 longest levers of your body coming to bear on those structures, you're putting the knee cartilage at risk. But I'm really glad that Celeste mentioned breathing, because there's not a group of people I've worked with, and that includes athletes, dancers, people, from all ranges of ability and disability. There's not a group that I've encountered that has more disordered breathing than yoga practitioners. And I don't want to necessarily, point out Ashtanga in particular, but whenever you're explicitly having these conversations about bandhas and making that not just part of the technique of a practice, but this idea that it's something that is good to be doing like all the time, then you run into some of the things Celeste was talking about, where there's a lot of discoordination between the pelvic floor and the respiratory diaphragm. And there's a history in Ashtanga, for example, of women having very difficult labor and childbirth because of their inability to release their mula bandha. And just to pick up on what Celeste said, yes, in order for a muscle to be functioning normally, particularly one that you want to be engaging in a technique, you have to make sure you can relax it first. And a lot of people have a lot of tension around the respiratory and the pelvic and the vocal diaphragms to begin with. And then to add on top of that a technique where you're supposed to be engaging them in a particular way without first ensuring that someone is able to actually relax those structures, that's just asking for trouble. And I do see that quite a bit. So I could go on, but for a while here in New York, I made a pretty good living, because I'm also a body worker. You can see my table behind me. I made a pretty good living dealing with asana related injuries, and a lot of them came from the Ashtanga practicing community when it was getting very, very popular here. So I'll just leave it at that. I'm sure others will have more to add.
Thanks, Leslie. Francesca, the same. What are the most common injuries you see?
Just as Leslie said, knees for sure, definitely. Also because what I realize when I teach is that people really have very little awareness of their body, especially when they're beginners, and they tend to pull the knees as if it was some kind of separated objects from their body. So they don't really have a lot of awareness of what they're doing. And very often, especially in Italy, what I notice is that there is not very much anatomy education amongst teachers, unfortunately. So they're still teaching with very old misconceptions about the practice, whereas the injury can be a sort of an opening towards something. Personally, I always say the injuries only open the doors of hospital. So you don't really need to force yourself in doing anything. And actually, I have to say that I do tend to modify a lot, especially with beginners, and especially when the person that begins the practice of Ashtanga yoga is in their 40s or 50s, and they don't have any specific training before that. There are a lot of people that start practicing yoga for fitness reasons, because the doctor suggested, you know, just do some yoga as if it was some kind of cure-all practice. And then in this case, I tend to modify a lot before they approach half or full lotus. And the is I witness a lot are actually back injuries. Back injuries that come again from, unfortunately, from bad adjustments. I even met a practitioner who is now in her 60s. She's an advanced practitioner, and she had a broken vertebra because of a bad adjustment in Asana. You know, she had both her legs behind her head, and the teacher pressed with the foot against her back. And obviously, she had a very bad accident. So these things still happen. And I think that we really need more anatomy learning and studying amongst yoga teachers. Unfortunately, the rise of 200 hours teacher trainings, often online, make people believe, oh, I'm a qualified teacher now. I can do whatever I want. You know, I can teach Ashtanga. And sometimes these teachers are very young as well. They don't have too much experience. And unfortunately, this is the way injuries happen very often. I mean, obviously, there are some very good 200 hours teacher trainings, but there should be just a starting point. Not make few people, oh, I'm ready to teach now. You know, so you really do need a lot of experience. And personally, I remember that when I started, I took a 4-year British School of Yoga teacher training course. And I remember that just to be admitted, I had to bring a paper where my teacher, and it was Amish at the time, was certifying that I was studying with him daily in his practice. So I think this is also a good point. We don't have this kind of entry level in teacher training. I could be just a total beginner and decide to do a teacher training. And I don't think this is a very good way to put teachers on the market, personally. Unfortunately, that's the way it works now. But you do need to have some experience of your own body first, maybe assisting a teacher in a shala, live, possibly, not online, and then enter a teacher training. Okay,
Thanks, Francesca. Great answer. Yeah, it seems particularly to Ashtanga that there's this precedent for adjustments. I don't know, Celeste, you find it in Vinyasa as much, or Leslie in Vinyasa Krama, you don't find the adjustments so much, right? This whole thing about the adjustments, which is just so unfortunate that so many people are getting injured in adjustments of Ashtanga. It's just so unnecessary, which is really the sad thing of it. Yeah.
Well, the teachers get hurt administering the adjustments to a room full of people. So that's an important thing to remember. You find yourself in very awkward positions doing these assists, and so that's a risk as well. And I think, you know, this is a related topic, but it sort of encircles the whole thing that we're talking about. Is that, I hear about these stories, like Francesca was saying, about people being injured by other teachers because they show up on my table. And I hear the whole story of what happened. And I always ask the person, did you tell the teacher? Did you talk to the teacher about it? And the question, it's almost always no. Because, it's a natural human thing to avoid conflict, and that's a real built-in problem with our profession, is that the people that have critical feedback walk out the door and never come back. And so we hear the praise, we hear how we're transforming people's lives, and we have a vastly overrated sense of our own efficacy because of this dynamic, and I'll hear the stories, but the teacher won't. And so you know, we have to acknowledge this as educators and say, look, we need to provide a safe avenue for our students to have these difficult conversations so that we can be better teachers. Nobody likes to have these conversations about how we screwed up or whatever. You know, I mean, the first thing is don't hurt people, don't push and shove on them. Yeah, but sometimes it's just a word we said or something we did or something that didn't sit right, and we never hear about it. You know, I hear about it all the time, but it's the teacher that needs to hear it. And so we need to give some mechanism for feedback to our students so that we can be safer educators.
David, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, just for a little context for what it's worth, on Yoga Anatomy, we did a large survey. Total participants were 2,600 people. This is a few years ago. And it was all about injuries. And it was anonymous. So there was arguably a little bit more free reign. As Leslie was saying, you know, not everybody will say what happened. I've got a long list of people talking about their injuries and how they came about, all of this kind of stuff. Having said that, and again, just based on this survey, of the people who reported injuries, which was low, 25%, and that's on the extreme level of injury was only like 4% of total respondents. But anyway, 25 out of that 25%, 68.4% did not get that injury as a result of an adjustment. So although it is definitely happening through adjustments, the majority of people are not. And I always like, you know, context. So it's like not everybody's getting injured doing yoga. In fact, yoga injuries are low relative to almost all other physical activities. So, and within that, you're less likely to get injured by an adjustment, but that also depends on the style, you know? So if Ashtanga does more adjustments, then the percentage would likely be higher there as well. So just for context, that we don't all get sucked into thinking everybody's getting hurt all the time. They're not.
Well, David, did you distinguish between acute and chronic injury? Because those are different things.
Yes, there was a definition. Severe injuries were defined as the practitioner saw a doctor for a medical procedure related to the injury and or recovery time was more than 1 year. Those turned out to be very rare, and they made up about 9% of all reported injuries and 4% of the total sample. So that was a distinction we could. It was a big it was a long questionnaire as it was, so we had to, you know, pick and choose how in depth we could get at certain points. So anyway, just for context,
someone needing hip replacement after many years of practice of doing certain alignment things to themselves may not show up in a survey or respond to a question like that.
Yeah, they may not. That's also true. Yeah, just like it's not like people show up to practice with perfect bodies and pristine, and therefore you can say, oh, the yoga did this. Oh, it might have been the buildup of X, Y, or Z other activity. You show up on the mat and day 5, you get injured. Did yoga do it? So
and it might not
even account for that either.
It might not even have been related to the injury, something physical. It could have been that their eyes were not working well, or their vestibular system wasn't functioning well. There's so many other pieces of the puzzle that we need to consider, and that's where the conversation around pain neuroscience becomes really fascinating, because there's many more variables other than the biology, and people are allowed to have more than one problem. You know, they come with stuff and then they start yoga, and yeah, yoga seems like the trigger, but it is important to have these conversations, because if things are happening in the yoga world, that could be preventable, even though they are bringing stuff. Like, it should be sort of a healing practice.
Yeah, excellent. Very chatty panel today. Usually we don't have so much chatting amongst us. So I have to get on. Sorry, Francesca, we'll come back in a second. I have to get on to our second question, which is it's a little, again, as Leslie said, we're kind of circling around the same issue, but again, really. So it's kind of a repeat, but you know, there is a difference to it. Which asanas are the ones you particularly look out for, and what modifications would you recommend for specific asanas? For example, for shoulder, knee, etc. So I'm going to ask Day that first of all, actually. Hi, Day. You haven't spoken yet.
Yeah. Hey, I guess there's 3 ways that you can answer this question. The easy answer, the generic answer, is just to remove all really deep yoga asanas. Anything that's like overemphasis of contortionistic flexibility. Why the hell do we need to do that? It can just go and you can still get the same benefits from your yoga practice. So that's the easy answer. Remove deep yoga asanas, keep the good ones, keep the easier ones, more accessible ones, ones that don't require this extreme flexibility, like Trikonasana, Janu Sirsasana, Baddha Konasana. These are really beneficial yoga asanas that are really direct and really simple. Lateral bending, a little bit of twisting, a little bit of forward bending, things like that. Doesn't have to become this extreme feat to be able to put both legs behind your head or catch your ankles and things like that. What's the need for it? And pretty much the easy way is just to remove it. The harder answer is what most people are saying. To echo it is just education, real education, which yoga teachers don't have. I've done teacher trainings. I've been to Mysore and done the whatever it was, advanced authorization course, whatever it was. There's no education in it whatsoever. The education is, this is a yoga asana, this is the vinyasa count, this is what to do. There's no discussion about how to do it or even why to do it. Why the hell are we doing some of these deep yoga asanas in the first place? So you just get sucked up in this, one asana to the next to the next. So I think that the hard answer is education, and of course, near impossible to regulate something like that. And I would say, yeah, more emphasis needs to go towards individual postural assessments and more individuated type programming rather than everybody trying to take square pegs and round holes and make everybody look the same and do the exact same practice in the exact same series. And then so with an easy answer, a harder answer, and then I'll give an honest answer, which is to quit while you're ahead and start strength training 3 times a week and do a little stretching and call it a day and get the hell out of the yoga industry to begin with, because there's no qualifications in a huge majority of what people are doing. So I think it is all really risky, maybe less, as David was saying, less in terms of how frequent injuries are in comparison to other athletic or physical endeavors. Maybe it is on the lesser side. However, I think that with the amount of time investment, it's risky, because you're spending, if you're doing a true Ashtanga practice, 90 minutes to 2 hours a day, 6 days a week, what's the payoff in terms of your investment? If you're doing so much time and so much energy into a practice trying to put your legs behind your head or catch your ankles, and you're wind up feeling worse than when you started, well, then you have to sort of ask, what are you doing it for? So there's the answer.
I always wonder why I get day on Ashtanga things, really.
It's like, don't get me started.
Yeah, just don't do Ashtanga. But I think there's a narrative there I want also people to hear. David, I reckon you've got something to say on this. You were nodding away. Do you have anything to say in retort for
that? I think it's great to evaluate what you're doing and why the hell you're doing it. That's always good. The problem is that it often comes too late, and people aren't doing that early on. They're waiting until they get injured. They're waiting until they've drank all the Kool-Aid, they've gone off on their acid trip. They think they're going to find spiritual enlightenment at the end of 4th series, and they realize they probably could have had it at the end of Sun Salutations or whatever. And the problem is, the only thing I would, perhaps disagree with, it's not the pose. It's not even necessarily the sequence. Of course, we can make arguments about sequencing for individuals and problems and stuff like that, 100%. It's how we interact with it. It's how much of our power and energy we choose to give up to it. And we have to recognize that as well. So it's not that the system is completely bad or broken. Of course, it has its own bias. It creates certain patterns. That's all true too. You need to be mindful of that. And you need to engage with it in a way that your patterns and its patterns are not doing this. That's all. So you could do any practice you choose. Do it for your body and do it in your way. And arguably, you should be okay. If you have enough awareness about your own body, your own patterns, your own limitations, the reality of what's coming and absolutely what you're doing it for. I've never been an ankle grabber and backbends. That's not my body. I recognize that from the beginning.
Yeah.
So I didn't do it.
Lucky.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Ellen, do you want to be reminded of the question? Do you remember which asanas are the particular ones to look out for, and what modifications would you recommend? Do you have anything to add to that, Ellen? Yeah, just unmute yourself. Yeah. Unmute yourself, Ellen, and then you mute.
Repeat the question.
Oh,
Sorry.
there you go. Yeah. Okay. So, which asanas are the ones particular to look out for, and what modifications would you recommend for specific asanas? For example, for a shoulder or a knee issue.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I think, to start with, I agree with what has been said so far. And I think we underestimate the difficulty and the strength required to do the Ashtanga practice. And to take a complete beginner who might not have the strength or the core strength and have them doing chaturangas, for instance, might not be such a good idea. So I always assess the individual, whether they have the strength, and I take them back. I mean, I have a background in dance, and we did a lot of this developmental movement, and the first thing we do actually as human beings is to develop our core strength. And somehow with our cultural conditioning and our habitual tendencies, we lose it as we grow up. We lose these very basic patterns of movement and of strength. So I assess the students and I see whether they have these patterns. So I try to teach from that perspective, to take them back to the natural movement patterns and find the strength that is needed. So I might not necessarily have them doing chaturanga, but rather like do a shalabhasana, get your core strength, push up from there. So that's the one thing I really assess the individual students and look out for, that the basics are there. And then there's of course what I don't like to teach at all is the Adha Baddha Padmatanasana that comes fairly early in this series and it's actually such a complex movement where you put your knee at risk, you bend forward, you're struggling with balance, you lose the control. So I'm really looking out for this minefield asanas, and I would amend them. So I very much look at the individual, and I use that experience I have from dancing and movement and from dealing with this. And sometimes it's very, an intuitive reading of the students. And I try to catch their movement patterns and see how I can work with them very basically. And I don't need to stick to the Ashtanga series from A to Z. It's really an assessment of the individual students, I think.
Yeah, well, that Adha Baddha and Utthita Hasta Padangusthasana usually come at the end of primary series, not in the standing postures, right? These come right at the end, which makes more sense.
But relatively early in the series still, not having worked so much on opening the hips. And I agree, it's not for all to get into a lotus. It might not be accessible for all. And I agree with Dave. Why do we have to do that at that point? We can replace them with other very functional asana.
Rob, we haven't heard from you yet. do you have anything to add on the subject?
Well, I would say, look, every time we do an asana, there's a risk. If I stand up now and do samastiti, there's a risk that I fall over and break my neck. I mean, the risk is low, but there is a risk to it. And so we can't really say which asana to look out for. We have to think about the individual, which is Day was, for example, talking about, if we can assess the individual and understand their specific needs, their specific history, their injuries, then we know fairly quickly which asana are probably going to be beneficial, and also those ones which could carry risk or be harm to them. Of course, we can generalize, again, as everyone else has so far. We can talk about the lotus posture as being risky for knees. One thing I would add is muscle fatigue, particularly when we're talking about Ashtanga or the vinyasa that we're doing. The shoulders may be fine for fine vinyasa, but on the 6th, 7th, they start fatigue. Their core stability isn't there. The brunt of the weight is taken into the shoulder, and then that repetitive strain starts to build. So it's the number of asana as well sometimes, not just specific asana. Yeah. But again, to echo so many voices today, it's really, as a yoga teacher, being able to understand the individual in front of you. As a chiropractor, if every patient comes into me and I crack every single joint in their body, I might help some people, but I'm going to injure some people as well. But if I can get someone and analyze them, assess them, appreciate which vertebrae or which joint isn't working properly and work with that, or as a massage therapist, work on specific joints or specific areas, or as a physiotherapist, work on specific weaknesses or lack of conditioning in areas, then I've got the best chance of avoiding injury. So again, it comes back to teacher education. Yeah, I go and see my teacher Twariji for pranayama. He takes my pulse, a very specific analysis. And I think the issue when we take a class, for example, Ashtanga, people walk in the room, there's no assessment, everyone starts doing the same thing. And hopefully we pick up fairly quickly, okay, this individual is struggling with an injury, or they've maybe told you I've got a shoulder issue. We don't know really anything about it. So I think the initial steps are really important. Teachers really should be doing some kind of case history, but they don't have the training for it. And I think that ideally should change.
Absolutely. Yeah, I totally agree with that. As I was saying in my first, when I first started to speak, is that we need more and more education. And that's exactly what I do when I start teaching. I am lucky enough to have very small groups, and that's the way I want to keep it. And every time somebody new comes in, I usually suggest at least a couple of sessions on his own or her own, just to assess the way they move, their specific issues. Sometimes people don't even remember they had an accident or they had an injury, and you really need to talk to them to try to bring out their past history of injuries to understand what you're working with. And what I definitely find that made a total difference with me is actually to go on studying anatomy, continuously updating my anatomy knowledges. I don't know, maybe because I come from a family of surgeons, I am very, very fixated with anatomy and how the body works. But I really think that we need more and more education for teachers on this subject. It is paramount.
I think one of the problems now is just economies of scale. So you've got so many people in the room, like in a Mysore room or in a lead class, you just don't have that ability to teach them one-on-one. And, if you're a yoga teacher, generally you need bums on seats, more students. So that's a kind of difficult situation. Celeste.
Just to add to what you've just said, it's so hard when I think, first of all, we should just empower teachers to know that if you're helping people move, you're doing such a good job, because most people are so sedentary. So if you've got people in the room and they're moving, be really proud, because you're doing really the world such a huge service. But maybe something that can be added in, and I think this was mentioned before, I think it was Leslie that said, we just need to empower people with some critical thinking. So just before they go into something, if we remind them that it's okay if they don't want to do it, and if they get any signals from their body that potentially this is not the right thing for them to pursue or to get deeper in, that it's okay not to go ahead with that. I think we're so indoctrinated in certain styles that we've got certain landmarks we have to achieve within the practice. And that's obviously when we get really excited that the teacher's coming over to adjust us. Oh my goodness, I'm going to get this pose at last. And it's, I think what Day was saying, like there's really no prizes for this. Why are we doing this? That critical thinking is maybe just left out of the conversation.
Leslie.
If I may, you know, the traditional yoga teachings from the sutras, which my teacher and his father were very focused on, they give us a lens through which to view this whole conversation. And that would be the sutra about asana that talks about sthira and sukha, you know, and it's not just a conversation about the qualities that make an asana effective, you know, steadiness and ease, but the entire learning environment can be viewed through that lens as well. Because on the one hand, we have whatever structures what we're doing. You know, we're learning something, we're learning a technique, whether it's an asana or a breathing practice or even a meditation practice. There's a technique, and that gives it structure. But also there has to be inquiry, which is like the space that allows each person to see where they land in relation to this technique. What aspects of it am I able to do? Which aspects of it am I not able to do? So when we talk about assessment or learning or individualization, you know, that falls in the realm of the Suka, the space in which a person can see where they are in relation to this technique. And you have to have a balance of both in any learning environment. And I had to learn this in order to communicate this to a group of people. You know, I was so focused on the one-on-one that I lost the ability to teach group classes at one point, and they just turned into clinics, you know, where I would zero in on one person because I saw what they were doing. I made the mistake of actually looking at them while teaching a group practice. And then everyone would stop and watch what we were doing. And eventually it was like, okay, I'm just teaching clinic now. And until I figured out this, you know, until I cracked this code of, oh yeah, I can give each person in this room the agency to see how they're responding to what I'm teaching and tell them this is what we're doing, you know, then you have a balance of the sthira and sukha in a learning environment. So, you know, the sukha is the inquiry or the inquiry, sorry, we're doing British pronunciation maybe, the inquiry. And then the sthira, what gives it structure, is the technique. And the main thing that distinguishes the two is there's no wrong answer to an inquiry. You know, it's like there's no way to get it wrong. Even if your answer is, I'm absolutely confused, I have no idea what's going on. It's like, that's a great answer, recognizing your confusion, right? A technique you can get wrong. And that's the nature of a technique. And so, you know, we need to negotiate that as educators. So part of being an educator is being educated about what education is. And the yoga teachings gives us a strong clue with this sthira sukha lens.
Very nice contribution. Okay, moving on. David, should certain body types not do certain asanas?
When you say body types, are you mean like ecto, endo, and mesomorphs, or let's do it this way?
No, not really. Maybe I reframe it.
Just checking.
Certain people you see. Yeah, certain bodies. Yeah, no.
There's certain patterns of movement that you might recognize that probably shouldn't do certain postures, sure. You know, or you could go anatomically. You know, there's some people, you know, with strong internal rotation of their hips anatomically, maybe they're pigeon-toed growing up, probably going to be harder to do lotus without destroying your knee. So you can say those types of things, I think, but you know, beyond that, it's always going to come down to an individual basis. Always, you're going to recognize a pattern, and then you have to determine whether or not is this a muscular pattern, you know, or a neuromuscular pattern, or a neuromyofascial pattern, let's say, since I'm talking amongst a group of anatomists, you know, what is the totality of that pattern? And is that something that can be worked on? And sometimes you don't know until you try. You know, it doesn't mean try 100% or all at once. You lean into it a little bit. What's going on? What changes? Did anything change? Is it possible? You know, when you meet somebody who's been trying to do Lotus, let's say for 15 years, and they still can't do it, you know, it might just be their bone shape. Sure. So, but again, you don't always know that it's bone shape just by looking at them. You might have an inkling, but you can't say for sure. So
one thing we call is hypermobility. You might want to say something about that's a body type, hypermobile.
Yeah, hypermobile is, you know, the other end of the spectrum. You know, those people usually need to be undone. They need to be backed off, tightened, strengthened. At the end of the day, all of it is all of the problems, it becomes something around balance. It's like Shira Suka. It's what is the balance here? Is this imbalance or out of balance? Is it front to back? Is it right to left? Is it a spiral? If the person's hypermobile, they probably need to do tightening and strengthening as best they can, because if they're hypermobile, it's probably, you know, baked into their DNA. So we need to be more sensitive to that. So just depends on the individual.
Thanks, David. Excellent answer. I'm going to ask Day, actually. Leslie's spoken quite a lot. Day, you might have something to say about this. Should certain body types not do certain asanas?
That's something that I would say exactly what David said, which is like, it's really hard to categorize people and say, well, you fit into this box and you fit into this box. You can do it, but it's going to come down to an individual. And so, like the way that I answered before, the easy answer is just to remove deep yoga asanas, because like at the end of the day, what's the point? And then the hard way is to really understand individual people and like help them make decisions. So what Leslie was calling for, I think, to summarize, is more critical thinking from the practitioner and less of this like group think where you're like get kind of swept up into the whole thing of trying to do the next asana and get the excitement that Celeste was saying when a teacher comes and adjusts you. Oh, that's good. Oh, I'm getting a new pose. It's like, well, you're trying to ask for perspective and critical thinking from the student, from the practitioner, which a student may think that they're doing that. And they're totally swept. I can speak from experience. Okay, I'll make it personal and say, when you're in the Mysore room, when you're in an experience like that, where you're in a room of 50, 70 people and the teacher comes to adjust you, you suddenly feel special. You suddenly feel like, so you're asking for really an almost impossible exchange between student and teacher. You're asking for an educated teacher and an individualized student and critical thinking to happen all in a moment that most people get swept up in. So I think it's just an impossible conundrum, because you want to make sure that people are doing the right thing for their bodies. As a teacher, as a facilitator is a better word, and you want the student to have enough wherewithal to be a part of that decision, and usually the system kind of falls apart. So very difficult question, very difficult answer. How do you answer it? I don't know.
It's a pretty good answer. Thanks. All right, moving on. Adjustments seem to have caused many injuries unnecessarily, as we spoke about before. And how do you view the giving of physical assistance? And I'll take Rob as the first answer for this.
Let me tell you the best asana adjustment I ever got. Let me tell you the story, a very quick story. It was by Peter Sensen. Some of you may know him. It was in a London workshop a number of years ago. And I was in Paschimottanasana. And all he did was come and rub my shoulders. So I was like this. He just gave me a little gentle massage on my shoulder. All of a sudden, I relaxed my shoulders. The tension came out of my body. I started to breathe, and I softened into the posture. That, to me, was a great adjustment, because he could see the error that I was making. It was a simple error. I wasn't breathing properly. I had tension in my body. He didn't try and force me further forward. He didn't give me some generic adjustment. So doing a forward bend, so just push you further. Doing a back bend, just pull him more into a back bend. He saw what I was doing and he gave me guidance. Now, when I think about as a teacher, giving an adjustment to a posture to a student, you know, what do we want to do? We want to try and give them some kind of awareness. For me, it's often just about breath. That's a great adjustment as a guidance. If you think about a tennis coach or a golf coach, they don't actually take the tennis racket with your hand and push you and try and hit it further for you, do they? Or try and guide the racket or the club. They talk you through it. This is what I see. This is what I think is going on. Try this. And so this may be an adjustment, may be just a conversation. Breathe properly. Yeah, the arches of your feet aren't strong enough, so you're not supported in your standing postures. Just to give these generic adjustments in certain postures, which they seem to be in the Ashtanga, again, room if we're under the Ashtanga kind of focus today. Certain postures are just adjusted kind of routinely. Again, downward dog, you know, certain adjustments, specific adjustment, again and again and again. It's not necessarily needed. And I think sometimes, again, as teachers, when I think about when I first started teaching many years ago, I got a buzz out of adjusting people. Yeah, it put me on a bit of a ego trip. Yeah, I felt some kind of power within it, and I think we have to be careful of that, especially when we don't have a huge amount of knowledge of the body or the individual in front of us. It can be something that is damaging. So again, it comes down to, for me, not to try and repeat myself, is to really understand the individual in front of you and what they need rather than what you think they need.
Thanks, Rob. David, you mentioned adjustments before and how few people are getting injured by adjustments. Do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I do. I agree with Rob. I mean, you know, you just like when you're doing an asana, you should ask the question that they asked. What is the point? What am I trying to convey? Do I have a reason? Do I have an intention? And intentionless adjustments probably more likely to cause injury. And of course, if you don't have experience putting your hands on bodies, then you're more likely also to injure people. I've been a body worker since '98. So for me, and just to go back to a question, some stuff that came up earlier in terms of class size, when I teach Mysore, I limit it to 12 students. Always have. Maximum 12. I prefer 10. Why? Because I can then work with an individual. If I put my hands on somebody, because of my training and my experience, I gain all kinds of information about that person. Some known, some unknown, some verbal, so, you know, like some I can actually put words to, some I cannot. I'm sure Leslie's familiar with this as well. When you've been doing this for years, there is an exchange of information that happens. And so the conversation in the most ideal form, in my mind anyway, is my nervous system and their nervous system are having a conversation through our connection of touch, whether it's a simple touch or a more complex touch. And so the touch also has the capacity to instruct, to inform, as Rob mentioned, bring awareness to an area. So there's a whole variety of adjustments. They should not just be about deepening, pulling, pushing, grabbing, making somebody do something that they're not capable of doing on their own. So I just want to, I guess it's just the nuance is there if there's awareness about what you're doing and why you're doing it, and that there's actually a reason for it. And sometimes the reason can just be connection or bring attention to breath. It can be simple, it can be complex.
Yeah, I think we need to reframe physical adjustments to, you know, as you said, not to doing something to someone that they can't do themselves, as just, kind of helping them feel or understand their own body rather than, putting them deeper into a posture.
It's also, we get in this mindset in yoga practice that we're trying to fix something. We're not trying to fix something. We're trying to be something. I say this all the time to people. They're like, oh, where should I feel this? I mean, probably the number one question probably half of the panelists get is, where should I be feeling this? And my retort is always, where do you feel it? And sometimes the look is like, huh? Yeah, that's another example of putting the onus on the person to be in their experience. People, you don't have to try to be you don't have to be a triangle. You're expressing a triangle. Stop trying to make it look like somebody else's triangle. This is, maybe the worst sort of part of all of the lineages is that, things got put into pictures and videos that people can try to aspire to look like that other person, which they're never going to do. And this is how we get into that mindset of like, oh, how do I do that? Oh, something must be broken. I can't do it. I need to fix it. How do I fix it? Let me go to YouTube, find the right technique, find the right answer, find the right teacher. The answer is inside. Just be yourself.
Yeah, that's a good point. That one big problem is the whole visualization of the thing. When the early teachers came back from Mysore, they came back with lists of postures, which is very different to visual representations of how the posture should look, given obviously by the people that can, ostensibly do them best. Yeah, unfortunate. Okay, moving on. How have you learned from your injuries? So how you've learned from your injuries, and I'll ask Ellen that first.
First about the injury, there's a list of them. There's a shoulder injury, and there's lately a hip injury. That's a degenerative condition. It's an arthritis in the hips. So I had a hip replacement about 8 months ago. So for me as a teacher, I think the injuries are really the best way to. It's a great way to learn actually how other people are struggling to understand your students really. So what happened with my injury? First with my shoulders, I learned to adjust my practice. It's kind of a shock when you've been doing the Ashtanga series and you've been sticking to it for such a long time. Then you have to reassess what your practice is. So first I had to learn to change my practice and to be okay with that. And you come up against all the beliefs that exist around the, in the Ashtanga world, that you have to do it this way, you have to do it that way, and you sort of, are you allowed, is this, seeking permission to change something and to be comfortable with that? So that was the first thing, to feel really at ease with changing and doing something else. And that opened a whole new field of learning, just divert from the Ashtanga series and do something else. And then with the hip replacement, I learned a lot about recovery in itself, because what happened was that you get really stiff. So part of the injury is the injury itself. But what I see as the really big problem is this collateral damage, as I call it, what happens to your body, to your whole fascia system, that it tightens up, it pulls you out of alignment, and it makes you really, really stiff. So that's the body's own defense mechanism, that it tries to protect an injured part of the body. So for the first time in my life, I had like really stiff hamstrings, and it's nothing actually that you can do with that. I think it's a defense that you shouldn't mess so much with, because it's there for a reason. So in my recovery process, I had to just let the body take its time to release that tension. And then after a while, I could start to work with it. But I learned a whole lot about what it feels like to be really stiff and really tense, and how to work with that. because that was not in my experience at all. I never had like stiff hamstrings or this kind of tightness. I didn't really have to ever struggle very much with getting into a pose. Yeah, I think this one learning part was also about, you know, what we have been talking about. Why do we need to do all this advanced asana? What is it I really enjoy about the practice? What is the essence when I take away all the advanced asanas? I got more into like energy work, the really basics. How does my energy work within the body? And then you can really, I think my whole perspective changed. How can you harvest the outcome of these years and years of practice? How can you do a more internal practice, focus on the details, the release of the energy, the movement of energy around your body? And for that, you really don't need to do so advanced asana. It can be just a trikonasana, going deeply into that and experiencing the grounding, the lift, the opening through the body, or just sitting even in Dandasana or Paschimottanasana. So I started to work much more internally, and I also pay much more attention to detail, and that reflects my teaching as well. So I think it was a big learning experience on how little can I do and still have a satisfying practice. What is the essence? What is it that I need to be able to do? And that might have to do with just, you know, getting back from injury and recovery and just getting into a sense of flow again. Something like that. And how can I, if that is the essence to me, that is what I want to teach people. And how can I do that in the most efficient way? Yeah, I hope that answers.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thanks, Ellen. Francesca, do you have anything to add to that?
I was just saying, I was listening to Ellen and the experience is very similar. My very first injury was with my back, and it actually came because I have a past as a gymnast and a dancer. And when I started practicing Ashtanga, after a very strong adjustment, I actually had to slip disc, L4, L5, and L5 S1. And that was my very first stop, and it was very close to the beginning because I had been practicing only a couple of years. And the way I reacted to that injury is very different from the way I reacted to this last injury, which is the torn meniscus. Because it was really a choice to have surgery, because doctor told me, oh, you know, you usually at your age, because I'm 59 and I turned 60, this summer at your age, you can also lead with a torn meniscus. But personally, I really wanted to have the full mobility of my joint again. So I chose to have surgery to regain it. And it was a very long journey. I would say that actually it was you who encouraged me to take full notice again after almost 6 months just chatting on Instagram. And I said, yeah, no, it could be the time to do it. So it was a very long journey, and I had the opportunity to cultivate strength rather than flexibility, which was, you know, my talent. I am hypermobile, so flexibility was something that I could always rely on. So I learned to focus on different aspects of the practice as well. And also I learned, I very much understood the way less flexible people feel during certain postures. You know, earlier on, I couldn't understand when somebody was telling me, oh, but I cannot kneel down. I cannot do Sukta Viradhana. I cannot do Sukta Vajradhana. Yes, I could see it was difficult for them, but I couldn't really put myself in their shoes. So it was really, really helpful from this point of view, because I really had to understand and to work with it. And this has been very helpful with helping other people. Now I am much more aware of what they feel. And then the other thing I learned from it was to actually, I actually understood how much power fear has on our body. It can really contract our body very, very much. And I realized how you really have to work also with the psychological aspect of asanas with people. Sometimes people really have fears that cause very tight muscles around the joint, and that's the only problem. Like it was for me with Lotus, when I had to take Lotus back again, it was just at the end of it, because I had worked through rehabilitation, so it was about time to try it, but my muscles were so contracted because of fear. So yeah, I learned a lot, and I think I don't wish it on anyone. I don't wish anyone to have any injury, but if you are hypermobile or particularly talented at asana, injuries are really very, very important teachers. And then, of course, I learned also to listen to experts. And I went to experts to try and see what I could do with my body. You know, I'm 60, I've got these issues. It is not only a matter of having had surgery, but my recovery is obviously slower if compared to the recovery of a 20-year-old. What can I do? And I explored many different avenues. So it was really opening my mind a lot.
Ellen.
Yeah, I think
Nice
injury also forces you to do more like strength works, to work more specifically with recovery. And I think that it's a thing in the Ashtanga world specifically, that Ashtanga in itself is always enough. You don't need to do anything else. And I think that is not true. And I was one of those people who thought, you know, Ashtanga is, yeah, it's enough. You know, we're working so hard. It's full on. It's so hard work. And actually, I think that's one reason I probably damaged my shoulders. I didn't listen to the signals, and especially as we get older, I think we need to do more strength work. And that's something that injury, you don't do it until you're forced to. And that's what the injury taught me, that now I really have to do it. I can't postpone anymore. And I think it works, yeah. So.
Yeah, I think that's so many people are saying that now. You just need to put some strength work. And well, Celeste, I think we had a conversation on the last podcast about certain strength building in yoga, and yeah, and I'm totally an advocate for that. Dave, do you want to add to that? How have you learned from your injuries? I'm sure you have something to say.
Well, I think the biggest takeaway is that you have to learn adaptability, and that's the real. It's mental flexibility and not physical. So you have to learn to adapt, and you know, that part is probably the most useful. It's unfortunate that you have to take the long, hard road to come to that. So I guess that's the general answer, is that you learn to adapt. The personal answer is that when I was really dealing with the chronic pain, back pain, that I was doing a lot of deep back bending. I think what it really brought me to was what I started doing yoga for, the intention behind it, which was I wanted to feel good. I wanted to feel healthy. I wanted to feel strong. I wanted to have that elusive, healthy yoga glow that I saw other people who were doing yoga. You know, that's what I wanted. I wanted to look good, feel good. And then somehow other things became more important to what I was actually feeling, which was the thing that you get caught up in, the culture, the next pose, the achievement, the linear aspect of what Ashtanga is, which is primary series, second series, third series, going to Mysore, doing, you know, look, you may feel like you're better than that, but it takes perspective to get there. You have to like deal with that is the culture. and it's really easy to become a part of it. And so when you get hurt, at least in my experience, when you get hurt, you sort of realize, well, wait a minute. Again, why am I doing this again? Am I doing this to get the next posture? Am I doing this to get the authorization? Am I doing this to get the certification? Or am I doing this to feel good and feel stronger and feel healthier and become a better person? And then you begin to prioritize. And I think that that's the big takeaway from injury, is really trying to get at the heart of what you're doing. So that's a little bit more of an esoteric answer. There's, of course, other answers, understanding the more functional movement patterns, understanding that strength training is important, understanding, you know, some of the postural issues that were going on with me or others. Those are obviously the physical answers, but as a broad answer, being able to put yourself first is my takeaway.
It's a great answer. And I think it's, yeah, definitely a shared experience of mine. You start off doing yoga, it seems to make you feel better, and you've got all the right motivations. Then you go to Mysore, and not inherently because it's the fault of Mysore, but you get wrapped up in a certain group dynamic, which ends up not always making you feel good. And yeah, you just lose exactly as you said, you lose perspective, right? Yeah. Okay, so this is a change of pace now. How do you psychological factors and social factors play into the person's subjective experience of pain and healing? Bit of a mouthful. Celeste, I'd like to ask you this question.
I think that's the most important part of the question, is the word subjective. Guys, we have to remember that pain is a subjective experience. It's very different for every person. In fact, there aren't any pain receptors in our body. We only have something called nociceptors. And what nociceptors do is they relay signals of threat to your brain. And your brain then decides, okay, are there real threats here that I'm dealing with? Are they perceived? And even if the brain is dealing with real perceived threats, it then makes a decision whether or not it's going to choose the output of pain. And that's the important thing to remember, that it'll initiate protective responses that come under this umbrella, protective responses. So you can maybe write these down if you guys are listening, like anxiety, fatigue, stiffness, nausea, dizziness, and pain. These are all protective outputs the brain chooses based off of how safe it feels. And we know that pain and tissue damage aren't necessarily correlated, because if we look at amputees, they still feel pain in their amputated limb. And then there's these brilliant studies where they started to look at back pain, and they tried to figure out loads of different variables, core strength and working hours and the type of job people were doing. And across the board, across all the studies, job satisfaction came up as the highest risk factor. For if you hate your job, the chances of you having back pain go up. So there's a psychological element to that. And then, of course, the social element of that. These statistics are just mind-blowing, that if you have had adverse childhood experiences, 75% chance that you're going to develop chronic pain in later life. So there's so much more to the picture. And I think that this brilliant model that scientists have given us, which is the biopsychosocial model, takes into consideration that, yes, biology does play a role, but if you believe that your injury is something really serious that you're not going to be able to heal from, the chances of you healing from that go down significantly. So we really have to empower people that you are so resilient, and we need to be careful of our language. Like, we're using a lot of words like destroy your knees. Like this is creating a huge amount of suggestion in your brain. Your brain is this highly suggestible organ. It's looking for threat everywhere. And the teacher that you admire so much is telling you, if you pull your leg like that and do that with your twist, you're going to destroy your knees. We need to be so mindful that we play a huge role in people's experience of pain. And, there's like these amazing studies where they took asymptomatic people that have no pain, huge sample, like 3,100 people. It was massive. And these people had no pain, and they were from age brackets 20, 30, all the way through to their 70s. and they scanned their backs, like what kind of issues can we find if we scan? And there's horrible stuff, herniated discs, the disc height had lowered, people had annular fissures, they had facet joint syndrome, like all these terrible things were going on in these people's bodies, but they were asymptomatic. And there were other shoulder studies where they looked at pitchers who were also asymptomatic. And again, they scanned their shoulders and they found that large percentage of them had issues with their shoulders, like bursitis and rotator cuff related issues. But the thing is, are our imaging studies outstripping our population studies? And actually many scientists are now, when they start looking at all these factors, starting to realize it's a normal part of aging to have issues in your body. It's normal to have something that's inflamed or something that's torn. It doesn't mean you're necessarily going to end up in pain. And that's why it's so important that whilst it is a part of the conversation to talk about how we should be better adjusting, and we should educate, and we should analyze the individuals, absolutely. But also as teachers, we need to be really careful that we aren't adding to somebody's belief system that they are fragile somehow, that actually our bodies are very resilient. We can come through really challenging things. And so I really wanted to share that, because often when I'm in a yoga class and I hear people saying these words, I realize that that's part of the reason why they're struggling to come out of those challenges that they're dealing with. Yeah, I've got more to say on this, but I think I can talk for a long time.
Yeah, that was a great response, and we're going to do a podcast soon, so listen out for that. Okay, do you have anything to add to that, Leslie? Unmute yourself. Just unmute yourself.
Right. Yeah, I often talk about those particular studies. In fact, I have a chart that summarizes them. There's 6 distinct studies that when you average out the findings, 60.5% of that population that Celeste described was found to have what would be categorized as degenerative disc disease of some sort or other. And that, and that averages out to a middle-aged population of around 45 across all the studies. And so, the observation that correlation is not causation as far as disc damage and chronic back pain basically tells you that the only correlation there is that it's people with back pain that get MRIs, and if you're interested in that topic, actually, there's a very good book called The Way Out by Alan Gordon. And he talks about what is now being called neuroplastic pain. And this is in particular about people with chronic pain and how the body has learned to interpret normal proprioceptive and nociceptive information as pain. And it's happening in the brain, not in the place where you're experiencing the pain. And he actually talks you through in the book the whole process that he teaches to help get you out of this situation. And this is work that has been talked about for a long time. Dr. Sarno here in New York, who wrote the famous book Healing Back Pain, was the first to decouple the disc damage conversation from the chronic back pain conversation and say, this really does have a lot more to do with how we're handling our mind and our emotions than whether you have damaged discs or not. So yes, the whole biopsychosocial model is very, very important to consider when we're dealing with pain and injury. But just to get back to something really specific, because I talked about my crappy knees. One thing that I personally have specifically learned that I share everywhere I teach is how important our feet are. We are, after all, biped mammals, and we often don't get the education into our feet that we need to be better bipeds. And when my knees start yelling at me, and they frequently do, I've learned to interpret that as a request from my knees for my feet to be doing something different. And this is just one example of proprioceptive conversations that we can educate ourselves about that are always going on in our bodies. And so You know, I don't have that fear when I feel that pain from inside my knee joint that, oh my God, I'm going to need a knee joint replacement. I've now learned it's like, okay, what can I do to articulate my feet differently in this moment that's going to respond to that? And that's just one example of an overall model that we can have about how we're relating to our bodies. And I would say what we practice on our mats goes a long way towards introducing us to these conversations. And they become much more critical as we age, obviously. So I just wanted to throw that one in there too, because what have I learned from my knees, you know, and that's to really work on the strength and integrity of my base of support, which for a biped is their feet.
Oh, Rob, I'd like to contribute there.
Yeah, just fantastic stuff from Celeste and Leslie. And I just wanted to add one thing that my teacher Troy says, that the problem starts in the mind. And if the body is receptive, that problem, it comes as a seed, it drops into the body and it takes root. So yeah, everything, so much starts up here. You know, I take imaging of my patients when necessary. And the amount of times I see injuries in their spine, for example, that they had no idea that they're, no idea. And that's not because they are ignorant. It's just because they don't feel pain. It's not actually giving them any issue. So how we perceive problems, as Celeste is saying, whether we sometimes make them bigger than they actually are, is very, very easy to do. So yeah, yoga is not just asana, as we know. We're talking so much about asana today. There's other aspects of it, using the yogic texts, the sutras, for example, to help understand ourselves better. That's so important. And I think when injuries arise, we have to not just focus on the asana, it's the other practices which can be so useful to us.
Okay. Next question. What is your view of medical interventions? For example, operations or cortisone shots even. Is there a time when you would not suggest or suggest going to get a medical diagnosis or having an MRI, for example? David, I want to ask you that first.
Well, after that last bit of conversation, I'm not sure how I should answer. No, I'm just kidding. Yeah, you know, I totally agree. You know, we've known about the nocebo effect, not the placebo. There's a placebo effect. There's also a nocebo effect. You know, doctors saying things, or as Celeste was saying, yoga teachers adding in certain words. If you do this, blah, blah, blah will happen, when there's absolutely no basis to really say that, because you don't, unless people are predicting the future, which I guess is possible. But what I tell people is, depending on what you're going to do with that information, you know, like, or how you're going to perceive that information. With my knowledge, the doctor works for me. I don't work for the doctor. The old model is you go to the doctor and you do whatever the doctor says because the doctor said so. I mean, that's how it's always been, kind of. Of course, that is changing now. So I tell people, I go to the doctor and I listen to what they have to say from their point of view. And to me, that adds information that I can then use to make an intelligent decision from. So it's a data point. It's not the end all be all. So everybody's talking about their surgeries or knees. When I ended up going for knee surgery, but before that, I didn't go and get an MRI as an asymptomatic individual. I had all of the classic signs of a meniscus tear. There's a long story to go with it. Context matters there as well. It wasn't just randomly, all of a sudden one day my knee popped. But anyway, I went to the doctor. He was kind of like, you know, you can do something, not do something. He was quite good about it in that sense. He sent me for an MRI. It confirmed what he assumed. Long story short, I didn't have surgery right away. I waited 2 years. It got better. It definitely got better, and until it clicked again. And then I was limping again. So I decided to schedule a surgery, and I stayed awake for my surgery. Most people don't stay awake for their surgery, and it didn't take much, but it took me confirming multiple times to my doctor on the day of the surgery that there was no turning back, and if I did this, I was doing this. He's like, we're not stopping for you or whatever. Of course, I got a nerve block. I did get an injection at the knee, and in a way, it was the best thing I think I could have done for myself during the surgery. Not just, for everybody else so that I could have a story to tell in my anatomy workshops, but what we often don't remember or think about. Again, let me say this. I don't suggest people go get surgery. That's not for me to do anyway. Everybody should try to avoid surgery if possible. And then sometimes it's necessary. Obviously, emergency situations, definitely necessary. A meniscus, you could argue for or against it. I had a minor tear. What I never would have predicted was that and I'm conversing with the doctor while all of this is happening, right? And he knew I was an anatomy teacher, so of course he had to quiz me through the process to make sure that I actually was an anatomy teacher, which was fine. But watching the little piece of meniscus kind of float off into the synovial fluid, okay, there was no blood, whatever, no big deal. It's when you turn the camera onto the cartilage of the femur and the cartilage of the tibia that we saw these sort of dimples, almost like a golf ball. And I would never have imagined that it would be there, but why was it there? Because those surfaces had been rolling over an uneven surface because of the meniscus tear. And so, is there the potential for me to have arthritis later in life? Yes. As a slightly increased probability? Probably. Maybe I got it early enough. I don't know. I wouldn't be surprised, but or I shouldn't be surprised if it does happen as a result of that. But either way, sorry, I might have gotten off of the question a little bit, but it's better to have more information and make an informed decision than to stick your head in the sand and just, and this is the other thing I'll just say, and it was not being implied necessarily, but you can't also just walk around thinking, oh, it's all in my head, so I'll just fix everything with my head. And arguably, it would be possible, because after all, everything's happening in our head. But that's quite a big universal place. If you live your life from that place, like you truly operate from that highest level, then you might be able to change all kinds of things, as the sutras point out.
Can I add to something? Sorry,
yeah.
David, please first
No,
finish.
go ahead.
Sorry, I thought you were done.
I'm good.
I think it's so important just to also, so that people don't get the wrong idea, is that yes, pain is an output chosen by the brain, but that doesn't mean your pain is not real. And it doesn't mean it's in your mind. It's very real, and there's a collection of factors that are playing into your threat neuromatrix. And it could be things like a fight with your partner, your threat bucket fills up a little bit. You had job stress, your threat bucket fills up. You're watching the news these days and there's so much going on. There are a lot of people with terrible things going on in their bodies. When we scan them, we look at them, we're like, oh my God, you're falling apart. And they're like, yeah, but I'm fine, I've got no pain. And then there's other people, they've got literally nothing going on. Their biomechanics is perfect, and yet they're riddled with issues, and they get diagnosed with things like fibromyalgia because doctors don't have an answer for it. So yes, we could have horrible things going on in our bodies, and we should get more information. We should use and inform ourselves, but we also have to remember that you need to be so smart when you get that information, because statistics show that when you look at a scan of your body and you see that bulge or you see that tear, the increase of pain in your own body goes up 17%. It's crazy how suggestible the brain is. So it's not in your mind, it's not something you've made up, it's not something you can think yourself out of, but just try and remember that what's playing into your body's perception of threat is far bigger than tissues. It's more than what's going on from the neck down. Maybe you wear glasses and your eyes don't move around as much as they should. Or maybe you had a whiplash injury and you've got a brainstem thing going on. Or maybe your vestibular system's not working as well as it could. And it could be one or a combination of those factors that gives you knee pain. It's not necessarily because there's something wrong. And so very often we'll scan someone, they'll have an issue with their knee, and we'll start addressing other issues with them, like their eyes or their vestibular system, and the knee pain goes away. So just to remember that, like, the body is so complex, and two things happen when you start thinking of this complexity. One, you become very frustrated because there are so many variables to consider. But the second thing is great. You're so empowered, because now you're looking at the body through a holistic lens. You haven't got blinkers on, and you're not in the frame of mind that tissue damage equals pain. You're like, yes, I have tissue damage, but lots of people have tissue damage and they're okay. So maybe there's other things I can do to bring my threat levels down. And yes, sometimes you have to go for surgery 100%. And other times it's worth exploring the complexity of your system before you do that to make sure that you aren't missing a trick.
Really interesting stuff, actually. I also had a arthroscopy with a local anesthetic, David. But it was on the epidural, right? You didn't have an injection in your knee. You had an epidural. You had a knee injection.
Yeah, they injected. There's a nerve block at the knee level. That was it.
Only
Just
that.
the knee. Wow.
Because I had an arthroscopy, obviously no anesthetic as well, but all my life was anesthetized. So
No.
I couldn't feel all that, but I could see everything on the screen as well.
Yeah.
But just wanted to say one thing to Celeste. Before opting for surgery, I had explored every other possible option. I actually waited 8 months before having surgery. But the thing is, it's not only about pain, it's just not being able to move your knee properly, to have your full mobility in the knee.
100%, Francesca. It's sometimes the best thing for people.
Unfortunately,
yeah, you totally did the right thing. Totally.
And I have to say, it is true. A lot of people, when they get the scan, they get terrified. Oh my God, I've got everything. I didn't know I had this. I cannot do shoulder stand anymore. And they were doing shoulder stand before, and everything was absolutely fine. So both things are actually real. Unfortunately, again, as it is very much down to the individual. So we do have to work a lot with the individual.
Thanks, Francesca. I got to move on and shorten the questions, I think, now, so we can take a couple of questions, because there's a lot of questions in the chat box, I think. Well, enough we can take a couple. So from personal experience with your students, how do you go about restarting practice after surgery? And actually, I'll make that more specific, because for Ellen, how did you go about restarting practice after your hip operation? How did that go? Unmute yourself, Ellen. You have to unmute yourself. Yeah, you're muted.
Sorry. Actually, with the hip replacement, I think there's a lot of contradictory information. So first thing, I looked at the internet, and then I got really scared, because you shouldn't do anything. According to them, they are so precautious, because maybe 1% dislocate the replaced hip. So they are very, very precautious. So what I did, I went to a physio that specialized in sports injury recovery, who would understand that, okay, I want to move. So I started as soon as I could. Just really 2 weeks. Just about 2 weeks after my surgery, and walked down without crutches. Sorry, I just have to relocate. I walked down and I started doing strength exercises with him, but it was still and he gave me quite intense balancing and strength, Bulgarian squats and squatting and weights and these kind of things to really build up the strength around the joint. So I started very slowly with just strength exercises, and it's boring. I really missed getting back to my vinyasa, but that actually took quite a while because of the stiffness. I couldn't bend forward. There's so much stiffness around the joint. I haven't had that experience actually with students recovering from surgery. So I haven't really had students coming in and restarting their practice. So I wouldn't know. I can only speak for myself here, really, what I would do. But from writing about it, I see that people, sorry, I need to locate again. I see that people get very contradictory information about what they can do and what they should do. When I did my surgery, I specifically asked the surgeon to put my legs into lotus and make sure I got the full range of mobility. And that's and he did that. Actually, he told me after the operation. So I was very relieved about that. He said, you should regain full mobility. I put your leg in lotus up to your head and everything. But you have to wait because it takes 3 months for the joint capsule to grow back. So within that time, you have to be careful. But I wouldn't say I didn't have fear during that time. It was this fear of something going wrong and maybe popping out. So I had to find a balance between, you know, how much I could do in terms of mobility and how much I should do in terms of strength. But anyway, I would recommend working with someone who understands, you know, sport injury and understands your desire to move and your necessity to move. This is my living. This is my job. I need to move. I would be fine just sitting in an office. Probably I maybe wouldn't even need a hip replacement, because it's movement that, you know, it hurts when I move. It doesn't hurt when I sit still. And I also chose to have a hip replacement. My doctor would suggest I would wait longer, but my quality of life got so reduced and my practice got so reduced. So I just, and I was like David said, I think surgery sometimes also can be preventive, that it prevents greater damage in the long term. And I felt that due to the injury of my hip, my body gets so pulled out of alignment that it would cause a much larger injury if I left it for a longer time. And recovery takes about, I would say, 4 or 5 months. I'm still stiffer than before, but I can get back to lotus and do most things. Yeah.
Thanks for sharing that, Ellen. Really interesting. Last question before we open up to the chat box. I'm going to direct this to Leslie, actually. How might yoga therapy differ in methodology from yoga as a spiritual practice?
Oh, I may be the wrong person to ask that question of, because I have problems with the term yoga therapy to begin with. You know this. That's why you asked me that question, Adam. Thank you. Okay. Because I don't call myself a yoga therapist. I used to, and I wrote a whole article about this a while ago for the journal, about how I call myself a yoga educator. I think that's kind of a false distinction, really. I mean, you can make an argument as on a professional level that, you know, IAYT has a reason to exist and sort of oversee this field that we call yoga therapy. But the medicalizing of what we do as yoga educators has certain drawbacks, and that is to take it away from this recognition that essentially what yoga is a spiritual practice, and it sort of plays into the conflation of yoga and asana practice, you know, and that has its own risks, I would say, because let's put it this way: yoga therapy isn't physical therapy and just replacing traditional physical therapy practices with asanas. And I think a lot of people approach it that way. And there's this very mechanical, reductionistic, formulaic way of applying it. And I don't advocate that. The main distinction that I am constantly reminding myself of is that when people come to someone like me or like anyone on this panel for help with a problem, and they've sought help elsewhere and haven't 100% gotten better, we may be the first person they encounter whose job it is to help them focus on what's still going right instead of what's gone wrong. And I think there's a real danger for us to get sucked into that perspective. Oh, I have to know so much anatomy. I have to be a biomechanical expert. I have to learn all of these things in order to help people. It doesn't hurt to have that knowledge. It really doesn't. But it's not an essential part of who we are and what we do. My teacher would always say that, well, I'll sort of paraphrase him, because there's a checklist in terms of scope of practice of whether I can help somebody. Number one, are they breathing? So far, fortunately, everyone I've worked with, that's been true. Ruling out the cadavers in the anatomy lab. Okay, different story. Are they breathing? Can they move their body voluntarily, even a little bit? And can they focus their attention, even for a moment? Right? If all those three things are true, they can do yoga because they can bring their mind and their body together through their breath. Right? But that's what's going right. And there's always vastly more that's going right in a person's system than has gone wrong. I don't care how sick or injured or disabled they are. If the cells are doing their thing, there's prana and there's life and there can be healing, which, as has already been stated, is different than fixing. Healing consists of bringing the mind and the body together through the breath. And there's always, always more going right with a person than has gone wrong. And it's our job to remind people of that, not to get sucked into the dysfunction model, And to address the previous question, there are tremendous benefits that can be derived from people who are experts in what's gone wrong and how to fix it. I've had surgeries myself that were necessary, and I wanted to go to the person that has done 1,000 of those procedures, and so they can fix what's gone wrong in the most effective, safe way for me. Okay. But that's not us. We're the people who help you focus on what's still going right and to connect you or reconnect you with it. So that's the best way I think of to answer that question.
Excellent answer. Thank you, Leslie. Does anyone else have anything to say about that before we move on to the questions in the chat box?
Just one thing that I'd like to say.
Sure.
I like Leslie. I don't think there is such thing as yoga therapy. I think that yoga is therapy in itself. It's very much down to the way we approach it. I don't think we need so many labels. Yoga is spiritual, stop. And if you are using, you can even use the Ashtanga sequence in a therapeutic way. It's just our approach that matters very much. It's my personal opinion. So I wouldn't classify a specific yoga as yoga therapy. I think all yoga is therapy for the body and for the mind.
Thanks, Francesca. Ellen.
Yeah, I would agree to that. I think embodiment in itself, if we teach yoga as an embodiment practice, I think that in itself is both spiritual and therapeutic. Just the fact that we get people to take their shoes off and stand on the mat and focus into their bodies. I think that's the most important thing. And there's so much else to focus on that is healthy, apart from executing the postures in the correct way. That can be really healing and immensely beneficial to people. But that takes experience and courage as a teacher, and that's why we should have the most experience with our own bodies and our own process of embodiment, and teach people from that perspective, from that experience.
Thanks, Helen. Just look at your questions in the chat box now. We'll do a 15 minutes or so on this, and then we're done. First two are about shoulder injuries. So first person says, and the second is very similar, actually, just shoulder pain, really. This first is more specific and recurrent shoulder injury, tendinitis, similar inflammation, probably from some misalignment in chaturanga, perhaps, question mark. Any tips for exercising or strengthening my shoulders? And the second person is saying a very similar thing, I think. Anyone? Yeah, Leslie.
I just want to say one little thing, because it's such an Ashtanga heavy conversation. For everyone that does Ashtanga sequencing, try doing down dog to up dog to chaturanga, see what happens. It doesn't exist in that sequencing. And that's like the other side of that muscular pattern. There's a repetitive thing that happens over and over and over again in that particular vinyasa, where you go chaturanga, up dog, down dog a bajillion times in your life. Have you ever gone from down dog to up dog to chaturanga and see the kind of strength that's required just to do that move? That's one simple little thing you can try. And then ask yourself the question of, like, what kind of muscular development is going to need to happen in my body so that I can do that as easily as the more accustomed thing. And the other thing is, please remember, the pathway of weight from your hand to your spine does not pass through the back of your body. It passes through your sternoclavicular joints. You have to find a way to create bone to bone to bone to bone. The only ligaments that connect all of this to the rest of your body are here. Everything else is muscle. All this fiddling around with your shoulder blades in terms of finding a pathway of weight or support doesn't do you any good, because it has to come through here. That's just a little hint of something to inquire about.
Interesting. Rob?
For me as a chiropractor, my main focus is always the spine. And I generally, if someone comes to me with a shoulder issue, I always want to check the neck. The major nerve supply to the shoulder is from C5 and C6, so the 6th, 5th, and 6th cervical vertebrae. If there's an issue with those nerves aren't able to supply the shoulder musculature and the joint effectively, particularly the rotator cuff. And so that's a primary area for me to always rule in or rule out. The amount of shoulder issues I fix just by fixing the neck, doing nothing to the shoulder, I've lost count of. Of course, the shoulder can be affected independently of the spine and the nervous system to some extent, through repetitive trauma, repetitive movements, falls, for example. But the neck can be an interesting place to look.
Thanks, Rob. David, anything to say?
Yeah. One thing that ties to this is just keep in mind that in the general population, shoulders, knees, and backs are the most commonly injured areas. So there's no surprise that those three areas would show up in yoga as well, just to say. In terms of shoulders, and particularly chaturanga, probably don't follow the most common verbal cues that are given. As Leslie was saying, yes, the bone-to-bone connection and ligamentous structures that hold it is here, which is why proper muscle engagement is also required. Most people are not at all familiar with their serratus. I've written about this a million times. I've talked about it 100,000 times. Most people are not at all connected with their serratus, and if there were any muscle that were most core-like for the shoulder girdle, I'd put it on serratus myself, not including the rotator cuff for the actual shoulder joint itself, but for the pelvic girdle that lives in the upper half of your body, serratus is crucial. You don't have that, all kinds of other weird stuff's going to go on as well.
Thanks, David.
And one thing extra. Please remember that asana, muscular action in asana, is almost exclusively about pushing. Pulling is a whole other thing that our upper body can do. and it doesn't happen in asana practice. You need a rope wall, something to grab on, something to counterbalance all the pushing you're doing in asana and vinyasa practice. And that's a whole other side of something that just doesn't happen unless you pay specific attention to it. And that influences whether your shoulders are going to be happy or not. How good are they at pulling?
Celeste.
I think it's also worth mentioning that often where we feel the pain is not necessarily the root cause of it. And the body being so complex, sometimes the root cause is very far removed from the place that you're feeling it. So it just goes back to that old adage of just, we're so blinkered in the way we view the body. There's that allopathic medicine approach where there's a part that hurts and we look at that joint and we focus in on it, and maybe the joint above and the joint below. But the pain is a communication tool that's very vague. It doesn't really tell us where to direct our energy. So when you have got pain in your body, just keep an open mind as to what the root cause could be. Yeah, it could be your chaturanga, but that's a push-up. It's a fairly basic movement that a lot of people out in the fitness world are doing without issues. There just could be so many other variables. And one that comes to mind is when you're in a plank position and you're going down into chaturanga, your eyes have to converge, which for a lot of people is really hard. Even though it's a very basic thing that their eyes should be able to do, a lot of people don't do that very well, and that's extremely threatening for the brain. So then as a protective output, the brain might go, oh, do you know what, I'll give pain to the shoulder because that'll get them out of this position where I'm having to converge my eyes, which I don't feel safe doing. So there's so much more to the picture than just the joint in question.
Thanks. I'm going to ask this to Leslie, actually. What do you think of asking consent before adjusting? Was part of the tradition in the first place, or has it never been?
Well, I think it depends what you mean by adjusting. I don't do pushing, pulling, forcible touch interactions with people. I never did a lot of that to begin with, but much less these days. I think you can go overboard in either direction. On one end of the spectrum is don't ask, sneak up on them and show them. And that happens. I can't tell you how many injuries I've heard from people for whom that has been the source. They didn't even see it coming, right? So that's on one end of the spectrum. The other, though, is being so overly concerned that you're going to take a situation where people didn't have any issues with it and then get them thinking about all the possible issues they're going to have with touch and with consent and with triggering people and so on. So, I think it very much depends on, is this an open class situation? Is it a workshop situation? What's the context for that? There's for a while the little touch cards or whatever people were using. I mean, the Alliance was giving these out at one point, these little coasters. They can flip it for consent and turn it over from it. So I think each teacher has to make their own choice of how they want to address this. I don't think there's a universal way of asking for or receiving consent, but regardless of how you handle that, I think the era of walking around and your job as a teacher is to physically, mechanically manipulate people in the poses. I think that deserves some real inquiry as to whether that is at all appropriate in any situation anymore. And I know I'm talking to an Ashtanga crowd when I say that, and that's a big part of the methodology, but we can see certainly the negative consequences of that in a variety of ways over the years.
Great answer, Leslie. Thank you.
I'm good at not answering directly. I got that from Desikachar. He was famous for that. Yeah.
I mean, also, it's kind of a bit of a loaded question. Is that you go up to someone and say, is it okay for me to adjust you? And it's like, well, you're the teacher, the student. And I think Dave was saying, it's like, not many people are going to say no, you know, at that point. It takes a lot of courage also to be able to say no at that point. So Shashira says, one of my students who has ADHD has a tendency to push herself into the shapes. Because of that, is prone to injury. And it's difficult for her to slow down in her mind and to detect her limitations in the body. So how can I help her develop body awareness for a safe practice? Is the emphasis drishti or breath or pranayama? Celeste, I'm going to ask you to start with that.
This is just one tiny piece of a really big puzzle. One thing that could potentially be quite useful, particularly within a group setting, is to remind her to maybe physically touch with her hands her body while she's moving, because what that does is it actually gives the brain a clearer map of where she is in space. And so that might help her actually gain a sense of where she is and how it's feeling in the moment. And if anything is lending itself to something which is perhaps a bit sinister, hopefully that will give her additional sensory information to make an informed decision. But I can't stress enough, this is a highly, highly complex individual. So something like ADHD, there's so many different avenues through which you could hit that. That's just one way that I would begin to approach.
Thank you. A couple more questions. Almost there. I've been doing Asana, Ashtanga, for 20 years. I've never had knee pain issues and done Padmasana since day one, almost. And now I'm experiencing pain. If I am not very careful and warmed up, my hips will suffer. My hips with soft over, it's a long question. The pain goes away after 2 breaths, but it's still a bit stingy. I have no injury and have done anything new in entering the pose. Is it just wear and tear? Should I leave Padmasana out, or should I enter it with caution? I understand it's not necessary to do lotus, but it's a big part of the asana practice. My reason for doing something is still there for me. I'm 45. I'm wondering if this is just a normal development for my body, doing the same practice for so many years. Is it inevitable when we grow older that poses will just be done? We have done fine, will just start hurting us. Dave, you want to say something on that? You caught the question?
Do I recall the question?
Yeah, it's a long one.
Yeah. Well, I think that's where the question on injury and adaptability comes in, that you just have to figure it out and learn to adapt. And, you know, if you're really dead set on doing the Ashtanga practice and trying to follow the protocol, the procedure of one asana after the other, lotus is certainly in there. And so the thing to do is to, you know, take a good look at yourself, feel what's going on, approach it slowly. Like David said, lean into it, see how it feels, no need to force, and just do whatever happens for the day. I don't think that there's one answer to the part on, is this just inevitable? Is this age? Is this wear and tear? There's no way to answer that question, I think, emphatically.
Nice, thank you.
Well, there is,
Rob.
as we get old enough, yeah. You know, every pose you ever master, you're going to lose, except for Shavasana. So maybe just focus on that one, you know. Yeah, given enough age, you know, eventually it is inevitable. But that, you know, I think if we, how is it that we said this? If we resist the change that's inevitable, we miss the change that's possible. Think of it that way.
Rob, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, if I can just add, especially to what Dave was saying, is that not to guess, go and see someone. Go and see someone who can see you making those movements, yeah, and spot the potential imbalances in your body. That might be a physiotherapist, might be a chiropractor, experienced yoga teacher, but someone else's eyes on you and how you move is invaluable. I mean, I've studied the body for many years. I've had my own injuries. I practice asana all the time, pranayama, meditation, all these different things, but I can't always get everything that I need from myself and from the practice. So I still obviously have a teacher. I go and see other chiropractors sometimes, other fitness coaches, whatever it might be, just to get their insights in how they think my system, my body is not moving or working correctly. And then I can add that in. So I would advise the individual not to guess what the situation is, get some help, because potentially it does sound like there is an issue building up, bubbling away under the surface. And I'd much rather see that individual work through that successfully than just continue to do the same things that they're currently doing.
Thanks. David.
Yeah, I agree with all that. And we shouldn't be guessing about what's going on, which is what always happens when I get these types of emails. I'm like, I have no idea what's going on. I can't see you. I can't hear you. I can't anything. So it's all guessing. But having said that, the practitioner knows their body potentially better than anybody else ever could, depending on how much, they're hiding behind themselves, so to speak. You can work yourself into, I don't really know anything about my body. You can practice yoga for 20 years and still not know what it feels like to express triangle, because you've always been chasing somebody else's, as we said before. So what I always suggest to people is you explore. What if I do it this way? What if I don't do it in this order? What if I do a preparation before I do this? What if I prep this way? Is there a difference? What if I prep this way? Is there a difference? And this is what I do with anybody or everybody who presents some kind of problem in my class. It's like, okay, well, let's try to do it the opposite way. Let's try to do, oh, you were told never to do it this way? Well, let's try that way first, because I just tend to be a contrarian. That's just my nature. And you have to kind of come up with a way of, again, not 100% as we talked about before, but you lean in a little bit. What if I do this? What if I do this posture first? Be willing to experiment and own your practice. You're doing it. It ain't the teacher's, it's yours. Take responsibility for it. And I think this is the other thing that we need to do as teachers, in addition to everything that's been said, is get people to own their practice. Get people to take responsibility for it. Give it to them. A lot of people, and it's been kind of talked about a bit, we project all this stuff onto the teacher. We give all of our power away to the teacher. We get caught up in all that stuff, which is true. I know it. I've been there as well. As teachers, what we can do is give the power back to the student. Create an environment where the student actually has the power to say, you know what, no adjustment today. And they know that it's not because of a weird power dynamic that they can't speak. I know that happens a lot, and that's very real. So give it back to the student. Go ahead, make something up. Trust your intuition as to what you need to do to figure out why your knee has started hurting. And go to other people who have more experience or knowledge than you and get their perspective to help you figure it out. But don't put it on them to figure it out. Have them help you figure it out.
Yeah, great contribution. Thank you, David. Celeste.
The thing that I picked up on his or her question was the fact that they mentioned that they'd been doing the same practice for a long, long time. And we've got 5 seconds. Oh, then the hand lowers. Oh, there was a little error message. Sorry. They'd been doing the practice for the same way for so long. And I think that one of the things our nervous system loves is novelty. And that's why I really love David's answer. Like, when you're going to go into something and it's maybe not feeling 100%, don't assume that there's something wrong there. Maybe that's just a signal that we need to try something in a different way. I mean, she mentioned her hips, that's a ball and socket joint, and there's so many linear patterns within the practice. Maybe we should be doing some circular motions with that joint to help improve the mapping. And potentially by approaching with a little bit more novelty, that will actually help the brain feel safer and be like, oh, this is totally okay. But we're always doing the same thing the same way. And I think that that's really doing people a disservice.
Thank you. Well, we're almost out of time. I think we are out of time. So it remains to say to everyone, thank you for coming on, panelists. It's been great to have you. If you want to find more about everyone that's been on today, go to keilandyoga.com and you can find all their handles and their contacts from there. So thank you. Thanks for coming on, discussing. It's been a super interesting conversation, all of you. I've done stuff with all of you before, so it's nice to see you again as well. And thanks everyone for watching that came on as participants. So thanks everyone. It's been a fantastic chat, and you can see it on record, as and when you want. All right. Thank you. Thanks for coming on. Cheers, guys. Thank you. Bye.